Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some stitched gift tags and ornaments using the new Felt Stitch and Create collection from Spellbinders designed by Nicole Spohr. So there's several different dies in this collection. I only have a few of them. There are a lot more. There's a bunch of different woodland animals as well. I chose some of the Christmas ones to work with. I'm going to use them today, these first three, and I'm going to use them with cardstock. They also have some wool felt in the collection, and I have some, but I don't have enough to do what I want to do with it, so I have some on order. I'm waiting to get that before doing a video using the felt. The felt comes in a few different color combinations. This one is the holiday combination. There are 10 different felt squares in that each one of those collections. These are half felt squares, so they're half the size they normally would be, but it feels very, very nice, and I know it's going to be really nice to work with once I get the felt that I'm looking for to create what I'm wanting to create out of it. So the first one I'm going to be using is the felt candy cane die set. I have a bunch of different cardstocks cut out with the pieces that I want, and I'm doing a kind of a pastel color combination. So I have some white here, obviously, with some pink sand, Dahlia, Waterfall, and Teal Topaz. I've cut different things in different shades of the different color. For the first gift tag, I'm going to not even use stitching. I'm going to do some faux stitching. So I glued my two pieces of my candy cane together. I wanted it to be a little bit more stable, a little bit more thick. And then I'm going to attach the different pieces to the front of the candy cane. I'm just using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to do the gluing for this. Don't need anything fancy. And I want to make sure that my lines or my holes all line up when I'm placing each one of those pieces down. So I am using some sewing clips just to hold everything in place. These are just little clips that someone recommended to me on one of my stitching videos a couple months ago. So I bought some of them, and they're really handy to hold things in place while you're letting them dry. And like I said before, as I'm putting those pieces down, I'm lining up the different holes. So by using that liquid glue, it gives me that wiggle room in order to do that easily and line them up. Now, obviously, you can use any color combination when it comes to these. I'm doing a non-traditional, kind of a pastel color. I thought it would look really pretty, but obviously you can do more of a traditional color combination. The sky's the limit. These are really nice size. So if you put them over the top of an A2 card, they're about the same height. These are obviously, the candy cane is a little bit narrower than that, but it gives you an idea of the size. So perfect for ornaments. You could also use them for gift tags on top of a gift as well. What I think these would be really fun to do with, and my kids are past this age, but if they were still little kids, I would be doing this as a craft with them. I think it would be fun to piece this all together and then do the faux stitching. I know my girls would have absolutely loved it when they were younger. Again, they're a little bit old now. They're young adults, so they wouldn't enjoy it quite as, I mean, they probably would, but not as much as kids would. So I'm going to use a gold gel pen, and all I'm doing for the faux stitching is connecting each one of the dots with some gel pen lines. Now I am going over it a couple times because I want my lines to be a little bit thicker. I want it to be a little bit more prominent. It's really going to depend on how thick of a pen tip you have as to how much you would need to do this. I like using the gel pen, and especially the metallic gel pen, because it also gives that metallic look to it. Obviously, this isn't going to look exactly the same as actual stitching because these holes are a little bit bigger than, say, just tiny pierced holes, but I really love the final look of it. It's just one of the ways that you can use this set without the stitching, and I love knowing different ways to use different things. It just gives it a lot more value if you have many different ways that you can use it. So all I'm doing for the extra pieces here, these extra pieces are the berries and the holly, are going over and joining each one of the holes with some gel pen lines. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with the candy canes. Now the candy canes have lines all the way around, and then it also has lines on each one of those stripes of the candy cane. You can see how it comes together really, really quick doing this. So it's not a project that takes a really long time, and you could do this with any one of those dies. And obviously you could choose different pen colors as well. I'm using gold here because I wanted to see the contrast of the gold metallic on the cardstock. Obviously you could use silver. the sky's the limit when it comes to it. I do really like gel pens for this because they do have that little bit of sheen to them, as well as they just are a tiny little bit raised. So this comes together really, really quickly, as you can see. You don't have to spend a lot of time on these. That probably took longer to do the die cutting than it is to do the assembly for this, but I really love the final result of it and how it looked. Now that my base is done and the accessory pieces are done, I'm just going to add them, gluing them onto the front of the candy cane. You can put them wherever you want. I'm just putting that to the right side of the long part of the candy cane. Anytime I'm putting greenery or foliage or florals on my pieces, I like to shape them. So I shape it with my fingers. I'm kind of creating an S shape with it. And then the flat part of the tip of the leaf, I'm gluing those together, or pointing them together and gluing them together. Next, I'm going to use a piece of gold cord and just tie a bow. I wanted to have a little bit more dimension here. And I'm going to glue that bow down before gluing the berries down. Now, obviously, this is a step that you can miss. You don't necessarily have to have the bow there, but I really like the look that it gives. And by it just being a cord or a little piece of cord, it's not anything that overtakes the rest of the design. It's just very subtle, but I really love the texture that it adds. Then I'm going to put the berries on there, and then I'm going to let that dry, especially with that cord there. It's going to take a little bit longer to dry than normal. So I hold it for a few moments until that glue starts to hold, and then I let it dry completely before using that same cord to add a hanger to my ornament. Obviously, you've got a lot of selection when it comes to the holes at the top there, so you can put it through any one of them. And then tie the ends, and you've got a hanger to your gift tag or ornament. Now, I left the back part of this completely blank because I intended to use it as a gift tag. So you could double die cut the pieces for the front, and you could also decorate them on the back. If you wanted it an ornament and you wanted it to be able to twist around and see both sides, you could double die cut everything, mirror what I did on the front onto the back, and then if it's twisting and turning on your tree, you'll see a nice side no matter which side is showing. Now, I was going to leave it plain, but I ended up deciding to add some stickles to the berries, so I set that aside to let dry while working on the next one. And the next one I'm doing is the felt gingerbread boy or girl. I have some latte cardstock die cut here, and I'm also going to use some of the detailed dies to die cut some of the holes to do some of the stitching on the front. So there is the greenery or the holly or whatever it's supposed to be to go around the neck. So I'm going to place that on my die cut, and I like to do this after everything else is die cut so that I can position it exactly where I want it to be. And there's also a die to die cut where the buttons are going to go and where they're going to be stitched. Now, for all of the die cutting that I did, I made sure to use a die pick to poke out all of those little holes. You don't necessarily have to, but it's going to make your stitching so much easier to have them all out of the way. And I know it's a pain to have to do it. That was the hardest part about doing the die cutting, was taking all those little holes out, as well as taking any of the ones that had stuck in the dies. But it definitely has a cleaner look without those pieces in there. And it's a lot easier, obviously, to line up the holes as well. I took some vintage photo distress ink with an ink blending brush and just did some light ink blending around the edges. I like the look that this gives the edges of the gingerbread men. It makes them look like they're a little bit more like they're baked cookies with that darker ink around the edge. I'm doing it to both sides of the gingerbread. Again, I double cut this. I want this to be a little bit thicker. I'm going to stitch the two sides together, and this one I am doing the stitching on. So I want the back to look just as nice as the front. So I'm doing the ink blending on both the front and the back. The back only has the stitch marks around or the stitch holes to go around the outside edge. The front has all of that extra detail to it. So once that's done, I will let my ink set for just a few minutes just to make sure that it's dry before I continue on and start doing some of that stitching. I'm using an Altenew sticky mat to hold those pieces while I'm doing that ink blending. It really, really helps to keep everything in place and make sure it's not moving around. So I have floss left over from my advent calendar stitching. So that's what I'm using to do the stitching for this. So I'm using The first color that I'm using, it matches the Dahlia Cardstock. I'm going to use it to stitch the mouth. And just like before, you can use whatever color scheme you want. So I'm having my 3 ornaments have very similar color schemes so they coordinate together, but you can obviously change yours up. Now, because I am stitching on cardstock, it's really easy for the beginning and the ending of each of the stitching. I'm using some Best Ever craft tape to secure the end of my thread so that it is secured on the back, and because I'm having 2 pieces or putting 2 pieces together, it's going to hide any of that tape there. When it comes to stitching with felt, obviously you'd have to be a little bit different. You can't use the craft tape to hold it in place, but we'll get to that in that video. Now, when I'm doing my stitching, I'm using 2 threads. When you take the floss off of the skein, I think it's called, there are 6 in the string. I'm using 2 of them. You can use as much or as little as you want. I like the look of 2. I know there are people that like it a little bit thicker, so they tend to use 3. 2 is my personal preference. So I'm going to do the stitching on the front of the gingerbread man, get that all done before I'm going and doing the stitching around the outside edges. This way I can use that Best Ever craft tape to secure all of my thread ends and hide it with the back piece that's going to go on there. So I used some teal topaz colored thread to stitch the buttons in place, and I'm also using that for the greenery around the neck. Now, the front of this package has some little knots that you do with embroidery floss for berries on the greenery. At one point I used to know how to do them. I don't remember now, so I'm going to be using some gems afterwards. I wanted to do the gems anyways because it's going to add a little bit of extra sparkle and just a little bit of a different texture to it. If you know how to do those knots and want to do them, I think they would look fantastic as well. They would also add texture, just wouldn't add that sparkle to it. So when I'm doing this stitching, I'm just more concerned about it looking nice on the front because I know anything on the back is going to be completely covered. So I'm going up one hole, down the other, and then if I need to, I will go back to fill other holes. When it comes time to stitching around the outside edges of my pieces, I'm using a running stitch to go up one hole, down the next one, up the next one, down the next one, and going all the way around. For this ornament, I had planned to make the stitching line completely solid all the way around, which would require going around the outside twice to make sure they're all filled. But I ended up just sticking with the running stitch, and I really liked the look of it. So it looked like dash is going all the way around the outside of the piece. So you'll see a little bit of the gingerbread color between each one of the stitches. So you can have, or you can create the stitching that you want or the looks that you want with it. You could also do it so that you're only going up the holes and going around the outside edge of the cardstock. I think that would look cute as well. I didn't do that for any of the ornaments that I did in this video, but I also think that would be cute. Now I do take some glue here and glue my 2 pieces together. For my third ornament, I'm not going to do that because after doing it with this one, I realize it's not necessary. The other thing about doing this is my glue set just a little bit too quick on me. So I got the upper half of the gingerbread, the lines or the dots, the holes lined up, but on one leg, they're not completely lined up. So it made it a little bit more challenging to do that stitching. It was still able to be done, but for the third one, I don't glue the 2 pieces together because it's really not necessary. Before doing the stitching on the outside, I'm just going to add the eyes and the cheeks. These pieces just get glued on. They're not stitched on, but you could stitch them on if you want. They don't have any stitching holes though, so you would have to make some up. I chose just to glue them on because this is cardstock and it's not felt. Felt would be a lot easier to just stitch them on if you wanted. Again, I wasn't really concerned about having that stitched look on them, so I just glued them on. Before I glue or before I do the stitching around the gingerbread man, I want to do the little Santa hat. Now, what I'm going to do with the Santa hat is do some stitching on the top of what's supposed to be the fur trim. And then I'm also going to do that to the second piece of it. And then I will join the 2 of them together. So one of the pieces of fur trim I have die cut out of white glitter cardstock. One is die cut out of just white cardstock. The white cardstock is going towards the back. The glitter cardstock is going towards the front. Now the glitter cardstock is definitely a little bit more challenging to do the stitching on because of its rough texture. It looks really pretty, but it's just not as easy as the plain or flat cardstock. Before putting my fur trim on, I want to stitch around the outside edges of my hat. So I'm doing a running stitch going all the way around, which is up one hole, down the next, up the next hole, down the next. So again, just like dashes all the way around. Once I've gone all the way around, I will turn around and do that running stitch the other way, filling in all of the other holes. So when you do it this way, you get just kind of a smooth stitching line all the way around, and it's on both sides. So you can't really tell which side is the front or which side is the back, other than the edge of the cardstock from the die cutting. Now I do my stitching around the entire perimeter of this, but you definitely don't necessarily need to do it on the bottom because that fur trim is going to be totally covering that. I clearly wasn't totally thinking when I was doing this, so I ended up doing the whole piece all the way around. But again, the fur stitching or the fur piece is going to be covering that bottom part, so it's not completely necessary to have that stitched. So you can see this stitching goes fairly quickly. What I tend to like to do is have all my pieces ready. I will organize them in a craft stacks, and then I will go and stitch them while watching a movie. I tend to have a hard time just sitting watching TV, so I usually have something else on the go while I'm doing it, whether it's playing a game of Sudoku on my phone or reading a book between commercials or doing some computer work. I tend to be doing double duty, so this is a perfect one to be doing that double duty with. So anytime that I'm not filming or areas that I'm not filming when I'm doing the stitching, I'm usually doing it off camera and do it while watching a movie or a TV show. It just it's not something that takes a lot of thought or a lot of brain power, so it's a great way to do it. Some of the stitching can get a little bit monotonous or repetitive, so by being able to do it and concentrate on something else, you can still enjoy it, or I still enjoy it that way. So now I'm going to add those fur pieces to that hat. I'm just lining up the holes, and this is where not doing the stitching on the bottom of that hat would be helpful. It would make it a lot easier to line up those holes. By doing that stitching there, it made it a little bit more difficult, which is why I said before that it doesn't need to be done, because any of that stitching that was previously done on the bottom of that hat is being covered anyways. So I am flipping my piece over just to make sure when I'm putting my thread up the next hole, it is the next hole. I want to make sure that I'm making sure not to miss any holes or not to do a double stitch in one of the holes. So I'm continuously going back and forth, flipping my piece over to make sure that I'm going up the right hole. For the fur trim piece, I am using some silver floss with it. I think it looks really pretty with the white glitter. You could use white floss as well. I just like the little accent that it gives with that silver floss. The silver floss is a little bit of a different texture than regular floss, so it's a little bit stiffer. It does tend to wrinkle and knot a little bit more. So you want to make sure if that happens, you can hold your piece up, let that string or floss dangle, and it will untangle itself. Now, one of the ways that I like to end my pieces or end my thread with using cardstock with these pieces is I take my needle, I put it down the next stitch hole or one of the stitch holes, and I just put it through the two pieces of cardstock to kind of an opposite area so that I have a long string behind my piece of cardstock. I don't use any glue because this is cardstock. Nothing is going to be pulled or moved or anything. I'm not worried about any of the stitches coming out. If you were worried about that, you could also put a dot of glue towards the end of the string that's closest to the cardstock. I want to say maybe like a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch away from where that stitch is. So that glue would be kind of dragged through the two pieces of cardstock and then would set and hold that string in place. Again, because these are cardstock pieces, they aren't going to be moved or manipulated like felt or fabric would. So I'm really not worried about those pieces coming apart. By going between the two pieces of cardstock, I can make sure that there's a long thread in there towards the opposite side and that those stitches are going to hold in place, and I haven't had any problems so far. So I did the same method for doing the pom-pom or the end of the hat there. And again, at the end of the stitching, I went down the next hole and then in between the two pieces of cardstock towards an opposite side. So now I'm ready to go around the gingerbread man. And I started it the same way as I've been ending the other pieces. I sped this up because it's very repetitive and very monotonous. So I'm just doing the running stitch all the way around. Again, going down one hole, up the next, down one, up the next, kind of creating dashes with my stitches. And like all my other pieces, I had intended when I started this to go around a second time and fill in all those gaps, but I just really liked the look of the stitching with this, so I ended up not doing it. So with that done, I'm ready to do the final assembly on my gingerbread man. I'm using the pieces for the little rickrack or the little icing pieces at the end of his arm, just gluing those flat. These don't have any stitching holes to them, so they don't need to be stitched down. Now I used the paper button die from this set to do the buttons for the front of the gingerbread man. You could also use real buttons. I think that would be a great way to add a little bit of texture to it when you're using with the felt as well. I think that would also be a great way to add texture, is using real buttons on there instead of die cut ones. But I also love the fact that there are dies in the set, so it gives you many options. Next, I'm going to glue the hat on, and then I'm going to take the berry gems and I'm going to put them on the little collar around his neck. So the berry is the color of the gems that I'm using here, and there's 4 different sizes in the pack. I'm using the next to largest size. I like to use a die pick to kind of pierce into the adhesive behind the gem and then place it where I want it to go. And I love that extra sparkle that it gives it. With our gingerbread man done, the last step is to add a little hanger on there. So I'm using some silver thread here, and I'm just using my needle to pierce through those holes. Because we've been stitching through those holes, they're a little bit smaller, so you can't really just push that thread through. I think the needle is definitely necessary. Tie those 2 ends together, and we have another tag or ornament. And again, the back of this is plain, so you can do a message on the back of there if you want, or you could leave it completely plain. Another option would be to add that rickrack on the edges of the arms and do some decorating on the back as well. So for my last ornament, I'm using the felt snowman star. This guy is absolutely adorable. Again, I'm using the same color scheme that I've been using throughout the video. I'll do the pieces on the front of the snowman first. I'm going to glue down the pieces for his eyes and his cheeks. Just like the last one, these don't have any stitching holes to them. They're just glued down flat. When you're working with the felt, you can easily add stitches to them, add those details. But because I'm just doing the cardstock, it's not necessary. I'm using a jewel picker to place them, or to pick them up and put them in the little dots of glue to place them. The only reason I didn't do it for the gingerbread man is because I could put my jewel picker in a wrong drawer and I couldn't find it then, and I found it a little bit later. So this particular die set does not have a die to put where the buttons are. You could use the same one from the gingerbread man, but what I end up doing is just gluing those buttons in place, and then I take a die pick and just pierce from the front to the back where those holes are. It's going to make it a lot easier for the stitching. For the stitching, the needle is kind of a dull needle, so it doesn't have a point on it. It's a little bit harder to push through cardstock, and I'm using fairly thick cardstock for this, so it's definitely would be a lot more challenging, and you'd end up getting some wrinkles in that cardstock if I were to try. So by using a die pick, it makes it really easy. The die picks have a pointy end to them, so it pierces through the cardstock a lot easier. It's kind of intended to do that as well. So first I'm going to do the little snowflake on the front here. I don't end up adding a gem to the snowflake, but I think it would be absolutely adorable to have some gems on there just to give it a little bit extra sparkle. Another option other than a gem would be just some dots of Stickles to add that little bit of sparkle to it. I think that would be great as well. I always love finding different ways to add extra texture and dimension to my pieces. Once I have those holes for the buttons, I can use that same thread to thread through there. I'm using some gold thread for this. Typically when I'm doing snowmen, I typically will choose silver. I just like the white and grays with silver. I ended up opting for gold for this simply because it's different than what I normally do. Now off screen, I did the mittens, and I did them in the same way as I'm doing my hat here. So I did the stitching at the bottom of the hat on both the top and the bottom layers. Now that that is done, I'm going to put those 2 pieces together, and I'm going to stitch the 2 pieces together around the top and the side edges of that. I'm using that same running stitch, so I'm going up 1, down the next, up 1, down the next, and then once I get to the end, I'm going to go the opposite way and fill in all of the holes. So by doing this, I'm leaving the bottom of that hat open. So when I have my ornament done, I can put some glue in there. I can put the head of the ornament in there and it's going to stay in place. And I will have a hat piece on the back of the ornament as well as the front. So it's going to look like the hat is on him and not just glued to the front. For the gingerbread man, I just glued it to the front because I hadn't really thought about how I wanted the back of it to look. And in between the ornaments, I thought this would be a better solution so that you can see those. So it looks as good as it does on the back as it does on the front. So like I said, I already did this to the mittens, to the gloves. So for each hand or point of the star, if you will, I have 2 mittens cut. I did my stitching on the bottom edge of them. Then I put the 2 of them together and I stitched them together so that there was an insert or a hole at the bottom so I could insert and glue the tip of the star inside that mitten. I thought it would just create the best final look for it. It also gave me the opportunity to use the tape to do the stitching on the bottom, but that tape is completely covered with the front and the back being stitched together, so you don't see any of that. Any of the edges or the extra threads, I just went down one hole between the 2 pieces of cardstock towards the opposite side so there was a long string. Any of those areas that I was worried about, because I have an opening here, I could just add a little bit of glue to secure that string, but I didn't find it quite as necessary. Again, we're working with cardstock. There's not a lot of pulling and tugging once the ornament is completely together. So I didn't find that necessary. So with the accessory pieces all stitched and ready to go, I'm ready to glue or to stitch my front and back snowman pieces. Now I'm going to create this snowman tag ornament, and I keep saying tag ornament, so you could use it as an ornament or you can use it as a tag, or you can start with a tag and then it becomes an ornament. I'm going to glue the front and the back together. Now for this one, I have 1 front cut, 2 backs cut, and I'll be doing the stitching for them off screen because it's repetitive of what I've already shown. So one of those backs goes behind my front to cover up all of that tape or any of the back sides of the stitching. The other back here, I'm going to do a score line about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch from the top, just to glue to the front of the star and create kind of a card tag thing. So you could do your writing, if you want to do a message in there, you could do your writing inside so it'd be nice and hidden. I still want some stitching around. We might as well utilize the holes there. For this, I can put the tape behind or above that score line. It's going to be glued to the front of the ornament, so that's going to be completely hidden. And I'm going to do that stitching off screen because it's very repetitive and the same as what I've already been doing. But while I'm doing that stitching, I might as well have some glue drying. So I'm going to glue those mittens on there, and you can see how easy easy one of them went on. And I just squirted some glue in there just so that that would hold those in. I was fairly liberal with the glue just to make sure that there was enough to make contact. Then I'm gluing on the the scarf. The scarf, I did my stitching off screen because it's exactly the same as what I've been doing, and there's nothing really nothing different about it. So I did that off screen as well as little accents for the hat. But by gluing them now, they'll be completely dry by the time that I have the stitching around the back of my ornament done. So I put the little strips on the hat there, and I'm also going to add my holly. This one comes with some holly that has just 1 stitch in the center, so that was done. And by gluing these pieces down, it's going to hide the tape on that stitching there. There's also a little tiny berries piece that is going to go on there as well. And just like before, I don't add any of these pieces to the back of the ornament because I don't plan on really seeing much of the back. But if you want to have more decoration on the back there, you can absolutely do that. So while those pieces completely dried, I did the stitching around the back of the ornament. Now I just have to tape it in place and trim that excess of the thread off. Now I'm going to put a little bit of the glue right above that score line to attach it to the back of the front, which is a weird sentence to say. Then I'm going to use my sewing clips just to hold those in place while they dry. And then I'm going to take the hat, I'm going to open up the bottom 2 pieces where it is joined together, but I can insert the top of the head and insert some glue. And again, I'm fairly liberal with that glue. I want to make sure that I have enough there to make contact with that cardstock to make sure that all of that glue is in place. And then last step, I did die cut and stitch an extra piece of that scarf. I thought it would look nice if that was on the back as well. This obviously was impossible for the mittens, because if I put the mittens on there, it would have closed the card even more. I wouldn't have been able to have as large of an area open, or to be able to be open to write a message on the inside. So I didn't do that with the mittens, but I thought it was nice to have the back part of the scarf on there. So now that that is done, the last step is to add a hanging part to my ornament. I'm using the same gold floss that I've used to stitch. This time I'm going to use 2 strands just to make it a little bit fuller, a little bit different from the last one. I also wanted to make sure to use up that excess thread that I had on there. When I was doing my stitching, I was using quite a bit of thread. I had my strings fairly long to make sure that I didn't run out halfway through. I wanted to make sure that I was going to be able to go all the way around that ornament. So I did have a little bit of excess left on my needle, and I didn't want that to go to waste. Last step here is to use some of those berry gems. These are the same gems that I used on the collar piece of the gingerbread man, and add that to the berries from the hat. And we have our finished snowman star. I think he looks absolutely adorable, and I love the texture that the stitching gives these ornaments. It makes them very unique. I think it would be fun for kids to do this as well. Obviously, you would adjust it to their skills and their knowledge, but I do think it's a fun way to get them involved in creating some Christmas ornaments and Christmas memories. Then there's the candy cane one that only has the faux stitching to it. Again, you could easily do the stitching on it the same way I did the gingerbread man and the snowman, but it's also nice to have an alternative. And sometimes you don't necessarily want to do all the stitching. Sometimes you want something a little bit easier, but it's nice to have different varieties and different alternatives to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all of the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day and a wonderful holiday season.